Hi, my name is Anthony Orelowitz. I am a design partner at Paragon Architects and one of the directors. Welcome to our second masterclass. The masterclass is about half an hour, and then there'll be a session at the end for some questions. So if you want to, please would you send some WhatsApp questions through. I think the address is on the actual invitation, and then those questions will be sent through to me at the end, and we can review them. Today we're going to look at, as a practice, as architectural practices, how financial controls can be used to mitigate against risk, and how we can use the financial controls to liberate your design process. So just to recap what we're going to do. So we're first going to look at understanding the market, and we're going to look at where you can get information around the market and where it's at, so that you can make decisive decisions about how to assess the current market and the future directions that you should take your business to. Then we're going to look at understanding client risk. So many of our practices work on risk, and so if we can mitigate against that risk, we can find that we're much more empowered in the way we engage in terms of our practices and the world around us. We're then going to look at understanding project risk. So many of us are very excited when we get massive projects, but unless those projects meet certain requirements, one can find that we are in a situation where those projects run for years and you lose a huge amount of money. So we are going to discuss how you can recognize where those projects are potentially problematic and how to deal with that, and then to try and find, by right-sizing, the kind of projects with clients that have a higher degree of becoming successful and going to market. I think it's very important then if you understand project risk and you understand client risk, when you put those together, you start to look at how the banks look at projects and how they assess risk. So as an architect, you can understand how banks start to look at your clients and the projects you're working on and the chances of them becoming successful. We're then going to look at controlling the QSing process. So we work with many good QSs, but you need to recognize if there's an issue that you need to intervene in, and how you can mitigate and change your design process so that your chances of the project happening are much more successful. Then we're going to look at controlling the engineering process, which is a very similar process. If you understand, we work with very good engineers, but sometimes we need to intervene in order to come up with alternative solutions around the design process, or sometimes we have to go away and redesign in order to make things work better without losing the quality of our original intent in terms of the design. And lastly, I'm going to talk about ERP systems, which we use in Paragon to manage our resourcing, our staff, and really our profitability of our organization, and how we can assess where we are as a business at any time. So let's have a look at understanding the market. So really, as an architectural practice, there's a lot of information out there for you to look to. So there are owners associations like SAPOA, which if you remember, they have a whole lot of information that you can access. We'll have a look at that just now. Then you get brokers like JLL, and there are many brokers that issue information for free and to their client base. And then there's specialized organizations like the Rueda and Associates, which basically look at historical data and then take that and build them into a model that and try and predict the future of where the market's going. And all of this is accessible. So as a practice, I think people need to understand these fundamentals before they make decisions about their practices, and it can guide their practices in terms of the kind of sectors that you look at and the kind of parts of the country that you want to grow your business into. It can also forewarn you of issues that might arise, and then you can take steps early on to try and mitigate against those potential losses or issues. So if you look at SAPOA, this is generally the kind of services they offer, but what we're really interested in is really the category that says research. If you look at that in more detail, we've got office and industrial vacancy reports, and we've also got retail trends reports. So those are kind of the primary areas that architects would look to. And then we have other things. If you have a more financial, in-depth knowledge of of the property industry and financial modeling, you can then look at cap and discount rate reports. I think that operating costs reports and rates and taxes reports are not relevant for us. And this is the kind of format that you can get the information, so it's really clear. So you can see that the information is issued per quarter, and you've got office vacancy reports, you've got retail trend reports, you've got industrial vacancy reports. So these are very powerful mechanisms to get an overview of the market. If you look at organizations like JLL, they have a different kind of information that you can get. So if you look at their reports, you can see that they really start looking at what's happening in the market currently. They look at by asset class and by GLA. They also look at a range of different parts of the industry. So you've got offices, industrial and retail, and the other specialized spaces where you can find spaces for residential and for hotels. And we as a practice would look at this. It's a 4-year moving average, and we can assess which industries we should start to look to grow our business into. So 10 years ago, Paragon only did offices, and over the last 7 to 8 years, we've been trying to transition the kind of work we do to a much more diversified space so we can mitigate against our risk. And it's been very successful for us. But that's really by gleaning data and trying to understand what that data gives you as an organization. The other kind of information you can get from this is where in the country there's a lot of activity. So you can see that primarily Gauteng is the main driver, and it's second to that is Cape Town. And following that, really, the rest of the country, you can see substantially less development happening in the country. So as Paragon architects, we have decided, after looking at information like this, that Cape Town would be the place that we need to expand to next. And for us as a business, it has been incredibly successful over the last 2 years. If you drill down into the information that's available, you can actually see that they even go down into a level of detail of the types of specific transactions. So here they've got the top 5 office transactions by value, and you can see that it's the actual property name, where it actually happens, the price that the transaction happened, the size of the job, the buyer, the seller, and the rate per square meter for the purchase. So why this is interesting for a practice like ours is that you can go and have a look at who's selling and see who's dispensing of properties, but more importantly, who's actually buying. And if you identify those buyers, it will inform you as to who's active in the market and where potentially you could be looking to build your client base. And then you get a third type of report, which is really the Rueda and Associates reports, which is really what they do is they publish every quarter. They take and interpret and publish data where they try and forecast and model what they predict is going to happen in the future. So this is very powerful for practices, because then you can, if you take all 3 of these types of components in terms of information and knowledge, you can make some decisions which are quite strategic to the success of your business. Then the next thing we're going to look at is really understanding client risk. As architects, we carry, especially the larger practices, or all practices, I suppose, do a lot of risk work. And in that environment, at Paragon, we've decided that we needed to come up with a tool to try and mitigate and reduce our exposure and our risk to what's already a risky space that we function in and compete in. So we came up with a chart. This was developed on the left-hand side, this chart was developed by Estelle Mayring in our office. And I just want to run through it with you. I think that it's really a valuable tool. So the first thing it does is really look at the client. It looks at, have they got experience? Does the client have a good reputation? Are they South African? And it runs through a whole lot of categories. Has the client committed in writing to our fees? Should the project become real? Is the client easy to work with? And is the client willing to take risks? For example, are they able to do designs that we believe would be a representative of the kind of architecture that we want to make? And then the next category there is really the site. So really importantly, does the client even own the site? Is the project in South Africa? What kind of control would we have over the process? Has the client given us all the information, the zoning? Is the zoning in place? You don't do work on risk and only find out that you haven't got the rights, or they're going to take 3 or 4 years for those rights to come through. And then we look at project risk. So is there funding in place for the project? Is the project competing against other projects? Are we already competing with other clients for the same tenant? That often happens in large practices. And so when you go through that, it comes up with a total score at the base. And I've been working on developing an extension to the risk matrix in terms of how we should look at approaching these results and applying them against our clients to see how we can reduce our exposure. So I think that if your score is between 0 and 30%, you need to actually charge clients that rate really badly. Okay, you need to charge them full fees. And what that does is it really separates out the wheat from the chaff. So you're able to take clients that really are high risk across all those sectors, and maybe you end up in a situation where they go away, or they're going to pay you. If they walk away, you're going to find out in the long run it actually saves you money. And if they pay you full fees, well, then you mitigate against that risk. And then you move into the place where people reach a score between 30 and 70%. And there we try to get our clients to at least cover our costs. And if they're on the lower end of the scale, we try to charge cost plus 25%. And if they're on the upper end of the scale, maybe cost plus 15%. And then you get clients that are your core business, which really are your clients that sit between 70 and 100%. And there we do work on risk. And we've got long-term relationships which are tried and tested. The only thing that varies within that risk category is really the fee that we charge each client in terms of the work that we do. So that's understanding and trying to mitigate against client risk. We're now going to look at project risk. So we're going to look at, first of all, sites that can be quite problematic. They look fantastic when you first get approached, but they can lead you down a road which is long and dark. So we'll look at that first, and then we're going to look at maybe some solutions to try and mitigate against that risk. So if you look at these 3 sites, okay, they all happen to be sites that are very close to the Gautrain. So you actually have the Gautrain station over here, and you have these 3 sites. And one has to start to question why these sites, which are probably the best sites in the country, have not been able to develop at the rate that they should. So if you take the first site, which is Stella Road, they've got about 90,000 square meters of rights. You can see the developers have done everything properly. They've built the basements that only services the top structure. They've made provisions for future development. So my opinion on this site is that this site really has 90,000 square meters of rights and would have on average about 9,000 cars coming in and out of that site every day. So if you look along the road over here, you've only got a left in and a left out, and you've got all the traffic from the whole of Stella Road coming out at this intersection over here. It's very hard to turn against the traffic in that direction, and at the moment the city is looking to upgrade that intersection and make it more pedestrian friendly by reducing the roadways that lead in and out of that intersection. And so it makes it very, very hard, okay, for that site to carry the traffic that's going to be put on that site. If you look at a site like Goro, which I think has about 200,000 square meters of rights, we end up with a situation where in South Africa, very large projects where the bulk is stacked upon one piece, one function above the other in terms of its types of architecture. I think that leads to a complexity which is really very hard to solve. So first of all, you've got to put in super basements, but the market's not strong enough to carry 200,000 square meters of rights. And if you put the full basements in, then you can't carry the costs. So those costs of the basements will basically just sink the scheme. And then in order to get the top structures to work, you've got to get the timing right. And so these jobs take years to come off, if ever. And I don't know whether South Africa can carry, because we just don't have the critical mass here. In Hong Kong, maybe it would work. Maybe in New York it would work. But in South Africa, where you got a large tenant query is, 10 to 20,000 square meters, okay, you need a lot of queries to fill up 200,000 square meters, even if you take the program of the architecture and break it up between hotels, residential, offices, and retail on the ground floor. it's a very difficult kind of assembly to put together, which is reflected in the fact that it's not been developed and it sits right on the Gautrain train station. The other site really is the Cry Eagle site. That site it has all the issues that the Gora site has, but it also has an issue that is limited in terms of its size. So in order to put 200,000 square meters of rights on that site, you're going to have to dig basements that are so deep that it's not viable from a affordability and also a functional point of view. You can't go down 14 basements. I think that becomes problematic, and the site is really small. It's also exacerbated by the fact that if you purchase that site, for example, at 4,000 Rand a bulk square meter, if you find you can only put on 100,000 square meters, then your bulk square meter really has to go up to 8,000 Rand a square meter, and then you can't proceed because none of your viabilities are going to work. So the only thing you can really do is write down the land purchase price in order to make the schemes work. So these are the kind of things as architects I think that we really need to be cognizant of, and not only rely on developers to kind of approach you and you're all excited. You need to actually assess where the risks on these land parcels actually sit. And so we've been looking at types of developments that we believe that are viable and that we can get to run. So I'd rather get 5 schemes of 10,000 square meters running than sit with a 50,000 square meter scheme that we just can't get into the market. So we're looking at the MoMA Gallery site on 7th Avenue in Parktown, and we're just going to run through conceptually what we thought of. So this image really just shows you if you just maximize the bulk, this is the kind of mass you'd put on the site. We spoke to our client and said, look, we don't think they should go for full bulk. We think that they should just go for what is right for the area, because the land was really bought as residential and rezoned. We had a discussion with our clients about, do you maximize your profits and never build, or do you build something that's viable and give something back to the surrounding community that actually works, and rather do a scheme that's actually viable and get it going. So on the scheme like this, we basically are only going to do, say, 20 residential or 30 residential units. We're going to do between 3,000 to 4,000 square meters of offices. We're going to have, say, 600 or 700 square meters of retail and restaurants, and the gallery will fill out the balance of the space. And the way we're working on these schemes is really to the green, okay, which is the residential block here at the top, this area over here, that sits on the upper levels. Then you've got the blue, which is really the offices, which is just over the next 2 floors, and the gallery is really sitting in the red. You can see the way we've designed the scheme is to actually spread the bulk not only across the site, but also vertically up on the site. So to encourage people to enter deep into the scheme and activate it right at the back. And also from the ground level up, we go from public space, and the higher you go up, it gets more and more private until eventually the roof space of the residential becomes the play areas for the children. And then we've inserted a whole lot of lungs into that space. So as you sit on 7th Avenue, you can see we've got the sculpture courtyard and the forest courtyard, and those are really very accessible by the public. And then we've got much more intimate courtyards, which is really the meditation spaces and the tranquil water court. And that's how the whole scheme really comes and sits together. So this is the view coming down 7th. If you were inside the active forest court, this is what you would see. So the upper levels is really residential. Straight ahead of you is the restaurants, and on the right-hand side, on the ground floor, are offices. And then you can see each roofscape is activated according to levels of privacy from public to private space as it moves up. And the same here with the water court. So the water court has restaurants here at the back of the site. It has direct access from the basements on the sides. It's got offices over 2 floors, and it's got residential on the upper level. And the response to the market has been very, very positive, and we believe that this is one mechanism of designing where what you're designing is productive and fruitful, and the outcome is more guaranteed that these bite-sized chunks can come to fruition. If you have a very large site, okay, with a lot of bulk, so this is a fictitious site that we're looking at. We're trying to develop a typology that will work. So here's 100,000 square meters of rights, but you can see unlike Goro or the Cry Eagle site, these sites are quite spread out, and they offer us different kinds of city making. So the kinds of things that we're looking to try and introduce into that urban environment is really looking at lifestyle, active streets, giving people who live there a sense of place. We're looking to try and integrate the building into a surrounding context in terms of its grain. We need to provide recreation and lifestyle for people and create a sense of community, and also do that through a sense of street edges, but also internal courtyards. And so the way we design the scheme financially, and this is really, these are architectural devices that we need to work with our developers to make sure that when we design, that the opportunities to actually see the buildings coming to fruition or these projects coming to fruition are realistic. So we've taken the scheme and broken it down into 10 or 9 blocks, and each block is 10,000 squares, and we've built in specific parking that relates to those areas in terms of the top structure above. And so they're bite-sized chunks that you can develop from the active street all the way down to the river, and build active courtyards and urban environments from day one. And so really this is the kind of fabric that we're looking at. So you're really building cities, but with a level of complexity and fine grain that we believe is going to be attractive to the market. So in a scheme like this, because it's primarily residential, it'd be between 5,000 to 7,000 square meters of residential on the top, you can see over here, and it has its own recreation space. Then we've built in about 3,000 or 4,000 square meters of offices with their own recreation and green spaces, and then we've activated the ground floor with retail. And all in all, that's really what the modeling looks like in terms of activating each block within the city. So we believe that architects, in dialogue with our developers, can find a language which will allow us to be more successful in getting our projects built. So when you get approached by a client and it's a massive scheme, you need to approach those with a huge amount of caution, and you really need to assess whether you can mitigate with your client against the potential pitfalls that those sites have to offer. So next, I think it's really important for architects to understand that we only interface with developers, but the reality is our developers, you know, they have to go and raise money. So whether they're raising them from funds, whether there are funds raising money internally, or whether they are developers going to banks, there are certain criteria that have to be met in order for schemes to go ahead. So exactly like I'm telling us to assess client risk and project risk, the banks do exactly the same. And so you'll find that the way that the bank will approach it is it'll look at the client risk with slightly different parameters to what we have been discussing. It'll look at project risks much more from a financial point of view and a viability, and the bank will assess those and set up client hurdles and project hurdles. So you'd have to be, say, in retail, maybe 80% let by area or by value. The client needs to show that they have experience in this field and that they have the correct backing behind them and experience. And those two things, the client hurdle and the project hurdles, are then sent up to credit. And credit assesses it as an impartial body. And it either says, yes, they're going to allow for their funding, or no, they're not going to fund that scheme. And if it's yes, there are going to be certain conditions precedent around which they will release that money. And our role within that process is to try and help our clients in terms of the project risk, reducing that risk and kind of trying to preempt where those project hurdles could be so that the schemes can be successful and they can proceed and go ahead. So those are really external risks that are out of our locus that really interface with our clients and with property developments. I think where we really do have some levels of control is really working with QSs and engineers. We work with many fantastic quantity surveyors, and often we would consider a job well done by a QS if it's within 2.5% of his budgetary amounts. Now, if you work with QSs that are not very good at what they do, you could end up with a job that is 5 or 7% over where it should be. And the net effect is either the job just won't go ahead, Or your client's going to turn around to you and go, sorry, you have to go and redesign the scheme, which really is going to mess with your design. It's basically going to degrade the quality of what you're making. So it's really important for architects to understand bills of quantities. It's very important for architects to understand when a QS puts the numbers down on a page, whether those numbers are accurate or not. And you'll see that I'm going to show you an example of a job that we've been working on and how by having knowledge you can empower yourself and your design not to be compromised and to ensure that the job can go ahead. So this is a potential scheme that we are looking at the moment. It's really a community center of sorts. And when our budget originally came through, so I'm just going to, you can see that the original budget came in at 39 million rand. And we knew from our experience that unless that bill sat at about 25 million rand, that scheme was never going to happen. So what we did was we took the bill and realized that we were going to have to make adjustments. First of all, we looked at our QS's numbers, and our QS is very good on this job, so the numbers were accurate. So we had to then go and look to intervene on our actual design without compromising the design. So we looked, first of all, we reduced the heights of the ground floor from 5 to 3.5 meters. We reduced the first floor from 4 meters to 3 meters, and we also reduced the areas. And it's very important that when you do these kind of large cuts through your building, that you're cutting substantial high value areas so that you're reducing glass areas, you're reducing services. It doesn't help from reducing basements or external areas or areas that haven't got a lot of glass in them, because you're really not going to move the needle. Then we looked at the basements, which had a lot of retaining walls, and worked out that we could batter the edges and we could ventilate naturally. We removed the brick walls in the basements and introduced wet walls into the basements. And then we replaced some of the glass balustrades with steel balustrades, reduced the preliminaries from 5% to 2.5%. We had a lift for people who were for accessible lifts, and we allowed for a ramp instead, and save 50,000 rand there. And so we go through the bill and we cut through the bill and change the architecture. But to a point where if you looked at the building, you would not tell that we've cut the building at all. When I show you the image of this, after this, you'll see it looks exactly like the image before. But the net effect is that we're able to reduce, the cost on this job from 39 million to 27 million rand without substantially changing the design. And then also, if we remove the basement and buy the land next door, potentially we can go from 27 million rand to 23. And we felt that we needed to be at 25. So when we presented this to our client, and all this was happening before we presented to our client, so we didn't go to our client and say it's going to cost 39 million rand and freak them out. We sat down with our QS because we know, that this could be an issue, and worked with the QS to reduce the costs up front. So when we went to the client, we said, this job could cost 25 million rand, and they were like, fantastic, let's go. And that's really, if you look at the image in the beginning and look at this image, they're effectively the same. It's really about knowledge and getting to really understand costs and the builds. In terms of engineers, once again, we work with fantastic engineers. Sometimes engineers just cannot come up with solutions that work, and other times the architects need to go and change their designs so that they can make engineering solutions work. So on Marsh, which is a building down in Alice Lane, we have a huge span, they call it the flying horse. And whatever we did, the engineer ended up with the column coming down through the middle of the floor plates, through that public space onto the ground. The self-weight of that spanning slab was so heavy that we couldn't reduce and take out the columns. So, we went away as architects and thought about what could we do. So we thought, what if we took oil drums and actually just inserted the oil drums, into the slab, and created a waffle slab and used the oil drums as void formers. Would that work? And we went back to the engineers, and the engineers took that idea and they ran with it, and it seemed that it worked. And this is really what it looks like before they cast the slab. So you can see the oil drums in place, and they form these void formers in the slab, which is incredibly deep. And we lightened the load, and in that way we were able to get away with columns coming through into the ground. So that's one way that architects can be innovative and ensure that designs go ahead. The other one is when, for example, when you're doing Alexander Forbes, we had very specialized shutters to hold the columns at Alexander Forbes. And these kind of interventions that I'm talking about, we do all the time. It's an ongoing process with the multiple pieces of the architecture that we make. So these columns, when they were first priced, we need specialized shutter work. We needed 3 columns and each column, 3 shutters, and each shutter cost about 800,000 Rand. So what we did was we were working with Tiber. We went to Tiber's yard and we had a look at what existing shutters they had in the shutter yard. And we realized that we could use 60% of their shutters or 70% of their shutters and only get specialized shutters made for the balance. And so if you look, the shutter on the right-hand side over here, let me just get the pen. This portion of the shutter over there is a standard shutter, and this portion over here is a specialized shutter. And so we were able to combine the two, same thing. The shutter here on the right is a standard shutter, and this is our specialized shutter on the side, in part, mainly over there. And so we were able to reduce their cost to 200,000 Rand per shutter, and we were able to proceed and carry on with the same intent that we wanted. So that work was done by someone in our office by the name of Amir. He spent hours trying to get this to work. And when we finally stripped those columns out, you can see he was hugging that first column as it came out of its shutter. So, you know, architects are very empowered and to make changes and control their process around the way that we work. But it takes time and practice and a certain kind of consciousness about the way that we work. I'm then going to just talk about our ERP systems. I mean, I don't know what kind of cost control systems you have in your practices. We use an ERP system, and really what it does is we basically take every single person in the office, we understand what they cost. We then look at what the office costs are that sit as an overhead in our office, and we basically then plan people against the actual project, and we can work out what that job should cost us. And with timesheets, we measure almost daily how we're doing relative to how we should be running our jobs. And if we find that the jobs are not becoming profitable, we can intervene early and not lose money without realizing it. So effectively, we've got the flexibility to access that information almost daily, weekly, or monthly. So at any time, I can tell you how much risk work a certain job has cost me. I can also tell you where we are relative to our budgets in order to make our margins and our profits. And this is critical for running a business that does risk work, for a business that works in very tough economic environments like we do in South Africa. All of that information feeds into our financial and accounting system, so it's all in one controlled environment. So I'm just going to give you an example. We've got a fantastic client. They approached us to do 500 units in Rosebank, and we designed a scheme for them which sold out really well in the first 3 or 4 weeks. We sold out a third of the schemes, and then beyond our client's control, there was Nenegate, and the Rand plummeted. The 150 odd clients that had put down deposits just walked away from the scheme. And we are left with a 450 room scheme in the middle of a recession. We had, as an architectural practice, already sunk so much money into the documentation and the 3D information and just negotiating with council that by the time our client turned around and said to us, look, this was the scheme, as you see it there, it was actually reduced to that. And we worked out that we could never, if this job ran even in the slither, we could never ever recover our costs against this job. And yet we are obligated to our relationship with our client to follow through. So by using the ERP system, you're able to schedule the job. This is an image of what it looks like to schedule work. And most importantly, this is a schedule of resources. So if you look at everybody in the practice, they come up as line items on that list. If they're green, it means they have just enough amount of work. If they're blue, it means they're being underutilized. And if they're red, they're being overutilized. And by using this knowledge, we're able to transfer workloads between people. and free up resources so that the overheads on jobs which are loss-making, okay, can be, without compromise, be managed, okay, so that people, when they're filling their timesheets and we reprogram jobs with the different staff components in order to save money, like we did on that scheme in Rosebank, we see that we can reduce our costs and our losses sevenfold. And so we were able to go from a situation which was really quite dire, keep our relationship and honor our commitments to our clients, and reduce our losses substantially in the way that, because of the kind of software that we've been using to manage our business. And so if you want to be a practice that's able to realize your designs, all these components that I've spoken about are important. It's not just about the value engineering, but it's assessing risk, it's taking on the right projects, it's being able to manage your finances and look at your profits. It forms a holistic system in which we try to operate, and we don't get it right all the time, but we're an ever improving practice, and so we're continually exploring all these components of our business and looking to explore ways to do things better. So that really brings me to the end of my talk. I hope it has been helpful, and thank you very much for your time. And I think we'll just see if there's any questions that have come through. Okay, so I've just got a question here saying, risk is part of the industry. Would it help to differentiate between risk and gamble? Yeah, I think that is correct. If you look at the way that we assess client risk, you do start to differentiate between acceptable levels of risk and levels of risk that are just beyond acceptable. And so you immediately find that within that risk environment that you're mitigating against any potential losses as best you can. It says here, what is your response to the comment that value engineering implies cutting corners? Look, I think that depends on the level of skill that you have. And if you focus on really understanding the cost makeups and how engineers work and how QSs work, and understand the real numbers that a bill of quantities has, then value engineering actually becomes a mechanism for empowering your design, because you can find money in other pockets of the job, okay, and bring that money into the scope of the works and put that into areas where you believe the money should be going into. You could also take things and rationalize them in a way which doesn't compromise the design, but still allows you to get the essence of what you're designing. And we've found that to be absolutely possible, yeah, in the way that we work. How does an architect establish good working relationships with a QS and avoid conflict? I think the secret to that relationship is finding a good QS. I think if you find a QS that is financially savvy, that is sensitive to your designs, you can form a really good partnership, and you can work with them for years. So some of the QSs we worked for 15, 20 years, same with the engineers. So we know how they think, they know how we work, and we're able to trust them, I think, is a big issue. So when a QS puts down a number on the table, and it's within that 2.5%, and you can't get the job to work, then as an architect, you've got to go away and reassess what you're doing. But if the QS puts down a number and it's 5% or 7% out or 10% out, which happens, and it happens more often than we would like, you know, you've got to have the knowledge to go back and start looking at the bill before you start cutting your design, and actually make sure that your design isn't compromised because the QS is just building fat into the bill so that they don't look like they at risk themselves. So good QS is a fantastic thing. We use, in terms of the software we use, it says what management software do you use? We use a software called Deltek. It's our ERP system, but there are many types of other ERPs that you could look at utilizing. I've got another query here. It says the bill of quantities example, line items for professional fees is 12%. Is that the whole basket of fees from all professionals to be shared? Look, it depends on the scale of the work. On a small job, really it's going to be the project manager, the architect, the QS, and the engineer. So yes, it would be a 12% fee. If it's going to be a larger job, then obviously you need rational fire engineers, you need mechanical, electrical, then the fee structure will change. And depending on your client, yes, that is really where we do work, and we're able to make a profit on that basis. I think software goes a long way, both besides the ERP, but having software like Navisworks and working with Revit, where your design process are integrated with the other consultants, has gone a long way to ensuring that that we have re-established levels of profitability even when our fees are under a huge amount of pressure. So, you know, over the years, through the 70s and 80s, the fees were dropping. What we're finding now is by using technology within those environments, we can at least mitigate against that and turn our jobs around. Next question. Is there a specific job role within the company that is purely focused on the time and resource management of projects, or is it done by a director or project architect? So we used to have someone who was dedicated to doing that kind of work. However, the architects on the jobs have to define the timelines and the resources, and they give that information over to that project management type role. We are reassessing that process at the moment, where we think that our financial manager who runs our ERP system is going to have to become more skilled in that process and take that work on going forward. But you need somebody who is focused and gets out of bed every day to look at those numbers and to assess where you are in terms of where you're supposed to be and where the reality is around each job type. The next question is, how does one manage the risk of delay in council approvals versus the client risk to build without approvals? Well, you know, if your client builds without approval, hopefully you've mitigated against that risk by you know, absolving yourself from the risk of that process. I'm afraid that the council approvals is a big issue. It's a big issue for us as a practice, especially in hard times like we're in now. So if you have an expectation that your cash flow is going to run at a certain date and it's delayed by 6 months, you know, we fundamentally start to have an issue. And you can get runners to try and go to the council to drive those processes through, but then everyone's sending runners to the council. So for me at the moment in this recession right now, one of the biggest issues that we have as Paragon is we have work, but how do we convert that work into real paying work by getting through council? And that's a challenge that we try and resolve every day. Next question, is there room for creativity if architects have to work faster and build more quickly? Look, I think that the software that we work with allows you to work much quicker in a much more creative way. I don't know about billing more quickly. So I think that the software that we use allows us to be more creative more quickly, to run more iterations. We're using software like Rhino, which can do multiple iterations in a fraction of the time that it takes us to normally work. We're using 3D printers to realize very complicated junctions and details that we might be developing. So I think that technology and creativity go hand in hand. And you know, I think, yes, we still remain very creative. It just so happens that the production side, doing the working drawings and doing the coordination, that's freed up in terms of the software we use. And so actually the software gives you more time to be creative, even if the jobs are more fast track. How much has BIM helped you with cost control? Yeah, BIM 360 is in process. We're not running many jobs with it at the moment. We're just starting in terms of that process. We got issues with BIM 360 in terms of the costs, the licenses, who buys the licenses, how we can afford that. It's bad enough that you know, that Revit is costing us over 100,000 Rand with computers in order to run the software, and then annual licensing fees. It's a big issue that we and many other practices are taking up with Autodesk and companies like Autodesk. At the moment, we're getting more value through our ERP systems than we are through managing our cost savings with BIM. I'm just going to read the next question. We all know that getting sucked in on projects, especially the big ones. Do you continue your assessment of the risk through the life of the risk phase of the project, and how do you mitigate getting pulled further and further into the scheme? I think, look, we generally have very good relationships with our clients. So when they buy very complex pieces of land, we generally trust that our clients have a way of understanding how they're going to get these large schemes done. If your client is certain about what they do and how they want to utilize that land parcel, it goes a long way to mitigating your risk, because if they say they want a hotel in a certain portion, you design a hotel and you do it once. If they want offices in another piece, you go and you do that piece. Your real risk, okay, is because maybe there are 3 or 4 buildings that you do on risk, and then they can sit and wait 3 or 4 years, but ultimately they will happen if your developer really understands their market. If the client doesn't understand his market and he keeps getting you to redesign buildings for every single tenant who comes along to their specific requirements, you've got a problem. And then you need to go to your client and say, look, that's what we do with our ERP systems. You go, to date, I've done 2 or 3 million rands with the risk work on the scheme. And when sometimes clients just don't even realize how much work you do because it drags out over 2 or 3 years. And if you go and show them how much risk work you've done, often we found that our clients do come to the party and they help us mitigate against some level of those costs. But if you can't go to your clients and say, this is what it's cost me to date and it's getting out of hand, okay, that client's got no idea about what you're incurring as costs, and you're going to find that you can't recover that cost. If you're working with clients that won't recover your costs and they don't know what they're doing, they need to look at the risk profile of where those clients sit. And sometimes having big jobs with bad clients is not the way you should be working, and you need to know when to walk away. So I'd like to thank you all for your time, and it's been a pleasure to do the second masterclass. I hope it's helpful, and if you have any questions, please mail them through, and I'll get back to you on your queries. So thank you very much.